So thank you all for joining us once again for the launch of the Sana'a Center for Strategic Studies' second report on gender, titled The Life Phases of a Yemeni Woman, authored by Marta Colburn, who is joining us to speak today and present her findings. And we'll also hear from Sana'a Center researchers Amal Nasser on her recent study on the status of women's recruitment, retention, and promotion in the Yemeni labor market, and from Mugahed on her ongoing research on the gendered impact of the coronavirus in Yemen. My name is AbuBakr al-Shamahi. I'm a researcher here at the Sana'a Center for Strategic Studies, and I'm joined in facilitating this event with Ambassador Charlotta Sparre, who is the director of the Swedish Dialogue Institute for the Middle East and North Africa. She's previously served as ambassador of Sweden to Egypt and Jordan, and Ambassador Sparre is a member of the Swedish Women's Mediation Network and a board member of the Center for Middle Eastern Studies and on the advisory council to the Secretary General of Religions for Peace. She has a number of publications and is a co-editor of the book, Reconstructing the Middle East, published by Routledge in 2017. Marta Colburn, who is our first speaker, is a gender and Yemen specialist with over 35 years of experience in the Middle East, leading organizations and supporting relief and development efforts, including 17 years working on Yemen. Ms. Colburn most recently served as a country program manager for UN Women Yemen, has had leadership roles with a number of international organizations, and authored numerous studies on Yemen. Amal Nasser is an economist with the Sana'a Center for Strategic Studies, focusing on the political economy of Yemen and the wider Middle East and North Africa. She is also the program lead of the humanitarian aid and its micro and macroeconomic effects in Yemen program. Nasser holds a Master's of Science in Industrial Network Economics from the Berlin Institute of Technology. And finally, Mugahed is a non-resident researcher at the Sana'a Center for Strategic Studies. As a sociologist, her work on Yemen focuses on women in prisons, community perceptions of women policing, and female voices and transitional justice. She's also the program lead of supporting broader inclusion and participation in the Yemeni peace process. Mugahed is also a published novelist and holds a Bachelor of Arts in Sociology from Sana'a University. So thank you all for joining us. Now, just to outline how this session will go about, we're going to be having 3 presentations, one from each of our panelists. Each of them will be approximately 7 minutes each. We'll then have opening questions from the facilitators, from Charlotta and myself, and we'll then open it up to, like I say, a 15 minutes there or thereabout question and answer session via the chat box, and we'll be hopefully reading out some of your questions. And then we'll allow the speakers to wrap up. So without further ado, I will hand over to Marta, who will be our first speaker. Thank you, Marta.
Okay, let's see. I'll go ahead and put my oh wait, now I need to start the, sorry, you guys, I'm not sure. Anyway, I'm just gonna go with this, even though it's not the full screen. Thank you everyone very much for, thank you very much for having me join this wonderful group today. I really look forward to it and hearing what the other speakers have to say as well. This research was, the goal of it was to examine the diversity of experiences of women in Yemen and girls in Yemen who face differing gender dynamics at various stages in their lives. It also seeks to address the limited understanding of the lives of Yemeni girls and women and the frequent absence of gender analysis by many stakeholders operating in Yemen. Finally, it provides age-specific recommendations to address salient issues in the current context of girls and women in Yemen. Gender relations in Yemen are shaped by diverse religious, cultural, social, and political traditions, with many unique aspects found in different parts of the country. Practices in gender segregation, mobility, veiling, as well as employment and education opportunities vary widely depending upon the age of the woman, where she is from, and her social and economic status. Furthermore, there are significant rural and urban differences prevailing with regards to fertility, literacy, and other dimensions of gender, including the gender division of labor. Finally, Yemen's highly stratified society and other factors contribute to layers of discrimination and exclusion for girls and women including those from among the Mohammedan group, internally displaced persons, or persons with disabilities. Key factors contributing to gender inequalities in Yemen include cultural norms and behaviors. And one source of success, I mean, it's a very complicated issue, but one source of such discrimination is that responsibilities of men accrue higher social status and therefore yield more rights and privileges. The responsibilities of men entail covering household expenses as well as protecting women and other social groups who are considered weak. Such traditions can gravely harm girls and women through practices such as child marriage, forced marriage, and other forms of gender-based violence, which are seen as increasing during the current conflict. However, at times, such traditions can benefit women and girls, as the concept of weakness can serve to shelter and protect female humanitarians and peacemakers. For example, women traveling in many parts of the country in a vehicle can provide shelter to male passengers at checkpoints, since in tribal areas, harm to anyone in a car with a woman would be considered black shame and result in severe financial and social consequences. The challenges that Yemeni women face can be overwhelming in the current conflict and humanitarian, economic, and political crises. Despite such daunting circumstances, many Yemeni women and girls are rising to meet such challenges, gaining experiences, empowering themselves. Yemeni women are risking their lives to open humanitarian corridors to bring food and water across front lines and sheltering displaced people and sheltering and sharing meals with their neighbors. These efforts reflect high levels of social solidarity and communal resilience. Even in desperate circumstances, Yemenis continue to show compassion and generosity to their neighbors, other villages, and those in need. Women perform significant roles in promoting resilience through connecting to neighbors, establishing and building social networks that contribute to social capital, which in urban areas often cross geographic, family, tribal, educational, and economic differences. In conclusion, Yemeni culture is very traditional with patriarchal elements that can disempower and contribute to the suffering of women and girls. However, it's also essential to remember that Yemeni fathers and mothers struggle to educate their daughters, protect them from harm, and support them to achieve their dreams. Unfortunately, the current crisis is destroying many positive gender traditions as it compromises the ability of families to provide for themselves. Too often, gender analysis focus on the negative aspects of Yemeni culture without recognizing beneficial elements in the home or community that are emerging in this time of crisis. This study has sought to highlight such challenges as well as to focus on positive factors which can be supported. It is incumbent on those implementing humanitarian development and peace-building efforts in Yemen to understand gender dynamics to better promote gender equality and the empowerment of Yemeni women and girls. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that presentation, Marta. And we will move on to Amal. Amal, I believe you're still on mute.
Okay, but you can see my screen, right? Okay, perfect. So basically my presentation is going to be about women in the in Yemen's formal economy, about employment. The results here are based on research we've conducted in partnership with the American University in Beirut. It was part of a regional project tackling employment challenges in 10 Arab countries. And we were responsible for the Yemen part of this research. So in this research, we conducted interviews with women, we did surveys with companies employing women, and also conducted focus group discussions. This presentation is based on the results coming from the 50 interviews we've done with women working in the formal economy. As a general overview, I'd like to say that the situation of female or women's employment in Yemen is very difficult. The image is quite bleak. We have the labor force participation rate at 6%, which is the lowest in the region and among the lowest in the world. This rate basically means the percentage of women in working age that are either working or seeking employment. So 6% is really low. We've seen that women's employment is concentrated in the informal economy and also in informal employment, which is basically employment in the informal economy and informal employment in the formal economy. So many definitions, but the idea is to show you that not just female employment is concentrated in the formal and the informal economy, but also most of the employment in the country. On top of that, we've seen that women's employment in the country in total numbers, in absolute numbers, is significantly lower than the male employment. Of Yemen's 4.8 million people employed, whether informally or formally, only 400,000 are women. And this is based on the latest figures that we have from the International Labour Office via survey conducted back in 2014. This definition their definition excludes almost 2 million women who are defined as own use producers, meaning working in agriculture, fishing, or hunting for the sake of their own final use. So these women are excluded. So we can say that the 400,000 people, women working in the economy, we have also another 2 million of them working. So maybe the disparity between the size of female employment and male employment is not as great as we see. In our research, we focused on studying the obstacles women face at the workplace. And these obstacles start from the very beginning, we can start from the exclusion from education. This is basically due to cultural norms that value male or boys' education more than girls' education. So we see less girls being enrolled in school or even going further up into university or higher education. We have also the challenge of infrastructure challenges that in rural areas where most of the Yemeni population, almost 70% of the Yemeni population is living, we have less schools in rural areas and also scarcity of teachers. Many women live in rural areas like the rest of the population, but also work in agriculture. This has also its roots with the migration of Yemeni labor into neighboring countries and having more women working in agriculture. So basically, that was also one of the reasons of them being excluded from education and therefore also being excluded from formal work. Another obstacle is familial and patriarchal constraints. Here we found also very interesting findings that family restrictions go beyond the choice of seeking employment, but also to the choice of profession. So certain families have preference for certain professions like doctors or being teachers that teach only in school, in girls' schools and so on. We have roughly one in five of the interviewed women in our sample reporting that their family interfered in the choice of their profession and also had negative views on them seeking employment. We have 50% of the women in our sample stating that family responsibilities are in a conflict with their work-life balance. On the policy level, we've seen that the government is really coming short in terms of providing family-friendly or women-friendly policies that can encourage more women into going to seek employment, like the scarcity of daycare facilities, and also the short period of maternal leave, and we can go and talk about parental leave, but that's another discussion. Another obstacle women face in the workplace in Yemen is the lack of acceptance of female authority. Nearly half of our sample reported that their employees are not responding to their orders, so they seek the help of another male employee to basically enforce their orders and so on. Another obstacle is the sexual harassment and discrimination at the workplace. Regarding sexual harassment, studies at the World Bank showed that 90% of women in Yemen have experienced sexual harassment in some way or another. But at the workplace, we have a number of interviewees reporting experiencing not just sexual harassment, but also physical attack at the workplace, which can be a factor in deterring women from seeking employment or also seeking promotion and staying in the labor force. We have half of the sample of our research reporting being discriminated against at the workplace based on their own gender, like someone denied a job because she was pregnant, someone realizing that her male peer was earning twice as much as she was doing for the same job. So we've seen patterns of pay inequality in the workplace. And also we've seen a discrimination based on gender, not just from other employees, but also from the state level, that women are not allowed to work in certain professions. One of them is, interestingly enough, is working in oil fields. So we have seen Yemeni universities educating women in becoming oil engineers, but at the end of the day, they cannot go to the field and work as an oil engineer. Continuing on the topic of discrimination, we've seen that fat consumption, which is, to me, is one of the interesting findings of this research, that we've seen that 24% of our sample reporting being excluded from decision-making in the workplace because many decisions are being taken in gatherings, chewing sessions that are male only. So by definition, they exclude women. We've heard also women reporting that male employees are being rewarded at the workplace by being invited or getting cut from their bosses, while women are completely excluded or neglected from this whole process. So basically, these are I was trying to highlight the main obstacles that women face in Yemen at the workplace. In the formal economy, if we're gonna go into the informal economy, I'm sure we'll find much more obstacles or challenges, because the very nature of it that allows for a greater space for exploitation of women and men in general, but also given the vulnerable position of women, we can see that exploitation among women will be more visible. So looking ahead, getting these results, I believe that we need some great advocacy work in Yemen to normalize women's presence in the labor force. Because you have this general knowledge, women who seek work are loose, are blah, blah, blah. But it's just basically, and I believe the war is kind of changing this notion that, okay, I'm not very happy about the reason behind it, that women are being forced into seeking employment. But if this would change or normalize the image of women or their presence in the labor market, so maybe we can take it as an upside of things. Yeah. In addition to that, I believe that authorities in all parts of the country should be held accountable for their lack of policies to protect women in terms of women movement, because we've seen also women reporting not being able to pursue certain jobs because they are away from their place of residence, or even because they don't feel safe enough commuting within their own city. So basically, this lack of providing some safety for women is a problem that authorities in all parts of the country need to address. Regarding qat, I believe legislation to ban the chewing of qat at the workplace is very needed to minimize the exclusion of women from decision-making at the workplace, and thereby also support their promotion into higher positions at the workplace. Finally, international stakeholders and donors, they should allocate more funding into designing more women-inclusive economic recovery plans and projects that provide real economic opportunities for women and provide them with formal economy, and also that can bring on board more women into the labor market. So basically, these are the findings of my research, or this part of the research regarding the interviews with women in the labor market. Yeah, thank you for listening, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Amal. The next speaker will be Reem Mugahed. Reem will be speaking in Arabic. So if you would like interpretation into English, you can use the English channel on our interpretation. You'll find the interpretation tab at the bottom right of your screen. Reem, over to you.
Thank you, AbuBakr. On the paper that I will talk about is based on the gender impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. This paper was based on interviews to follow up with the pandemic in Yemen. I conducted interviews with women starting in April 2020 during the first wave, as well as women from the Yemeni Women's Union from different governorates in Yemen. These interviews, we also conducted interviews recently to see how things have changed. I will summarize the results of this paper in 3 points: the health effects on gender-based violence, and economic effects to women over this period. With regards to the health impact of the pandemic, based on the interviews and opinions that I've collected and read about, I think there is a consensus that women have been most negatively affected by the pandemic. Healthcare in normal conditions is not a priority for women. Women are always the last to get healthcare, whether for economic or social reasons, whether because of problems in the roads, lack of security, difficulty traveling, or other reasons. So usually the priority in healthcare is for children than to men, while women are usually seen as being or having the lowest priority. During this pandemic in general, or during illness in general, women are responsible for caring for their families. I think this is not just in Yemen, but could be in the rest of the world. But women are expected to spend all of their time taking care of the ill, whether young or old. This could lead to them catching the virus, also them dealing with this excessive burden, and also not getting healthcare if they need it. And dealing also with the psychological stressors like death. One of the girls that I interviewed said that one of the women who was caring for patients at home, her own mother ended up dying, and she was blamed because she was told that she did not take sufficient care of her mother. I think the third point is Yemeni society has a number of conflicting social traditions. One of the examples that I saw in my research in this is that many of the families require having a female doctor to treat their woman, and they do not allow their female relatives to go to hospitals for this reason if there are male doctors who will be treating them. Either because they're afraid that they will be quarantined in the quarantine centers, they are afraid that it will be seen as a stigma that they have the illness or the virus, or because the women have to remain at home. Another reason that we found in the interviews was the bad reputation of the healthcare. During the first wave of the pandemic, there were rumors that there was a shot of mercy that they would be given and that this was what was killing them, not the virus. The reputation of the healthcare sector in Yemen was bad even before the war and before the pandemic, but during the war it has been almost completely destroyed. Figures show that 50% of the healthcare sector was almost completely destroyed. During the pandemic, there was only a limited number of healthcare facilities that could help patients of the pandemic, and for women to get these healthcare services was not seen as a priority. We got information from the manager of the quarantine center in Taiz. He said that only 5 to 10% of all of the patients that had come to the quarantine center were women, and this is a very, very low percentage with the pandemic spreading through a city like Taiz. Another point that I focused on in this study, or one of the outcomes of this paper, was the impact of the pandemic on gender-based violence. Historically, it has been proven that crises increase domestic violence, and they lead to economic stressors, loss of jobs, loss of income, and also breadwinners remaining more at home. An example of this is what happened during the Ebola and the Zika epidemics. And these healthcare measures put the children and women at increased risk of domestic or gender-based violence. The United Nations estimated that gender-based violence affects 33% of women around the world, but in Yemen, this rate, according to the United Nations, gender-based violence is around 63% since the beginning of the civil war in 2015, or it has gone up 63%. So with the pandemic, it has gone up even more, and this is what was confirmed by by officials from the Yemeni Women's Union and governorates like Aden, Hadramaut, and Taiz. The officials from the Yemeni Women's Union, they confirmed that gender-based violence or violence against women has increased. In Yemen, obviously, there is no reporting mechanism in the way that is accepted internationally, because social traditions do not allow this for women to report this kind of violence or assaults by the relatives or men. But there has been an increase, or a noticeable increase. And there was also a question on the effectiveness of the shelters. The Yemeni Women's Union is the only entity that provides this kind of service. And it was said that these shelters were closed at the beginning of the pandemics, but they restarted operations, but their resources and capacity are very low. And women are always afraid of going to these shelters because there had been a number of incidents of these shelters being attacked by the relatives or family members of the woman who had resorted to them. This violence might not be necessarily physical. One of the women that we interviewed, who had been working in a youth initiative at the beginning of the conflict, she said that they would deliver oxygen canisters to homes. And many of the women told her during the first wave that they were under a lot of stress, not because of the pandemic or the virus, but because they were forced to remain at home and couldn't even open windows. Yemen is a very conservative society. Women only leave for necessities or errands. Women do not usually go out for other reasons. And now with the pandemic, they were imprisoned at home. And one of the girls that was interviewed said that for men and boys, they had the freedom to go out. They had the freedom to go out in the neighborhood just to get some fresh air or to talk with each other, even if at a distance. But for women, they were imprisoned and kept in their homes. In a city like Aden, where the temperatures are very high, this was much, much worse than the pandemic for them. The last point was the economic impacts of the pandemic. Modern studies have shown that the pandemic has obviously affected the population as a whole, but women are at a greater risk. 19%, their jobs are 19% more at risk. Women make up 39% of the labor force around the world, but they are represented in the 3 of the 4 jobs that were lost the most, which is the hospitality and tourism sectors, restaurants and catering, retails, and recreation sectors. In Yemen, where the percentage of women in the labor force is very low. There are many women who work in services and retails, which require them being outside of their homes. There are women, for example, who sell homemade food in street vendors. There are traveling saleswomen who sell handicrafts or other items. There are also those who set up shops in schools where they sell homemade foods. Also those working in as makeup artists and as hairstylists, those working in wedding halls, teachers at girls' school, janitors, and also women who had started their own smaller micro enterprises like small restaurants. All of these kinds of projects were the ones that were most impacted during the first wave of the pandemic. During the second wave, there weren't as many precautionary measures, but all of these sectors and all of these jobs were significantly affected, or there was not as much demand for the services and goods they provide. This is just a brief summary. There are a lot of details in these three different issues. With regards to the recommendations, we had very quick recommendations for each part with regards, and I wanted the recommendations to be as realistic as possible. Usually we see a lot of recommendations presented on Yemen, and they don't seem to be very realistic. With regards to the healthcare situation, there were figures from the United Nations that were very beneficial, saying, for example, every 12 hours a pregnant woman died, and that women were getting less or fewer healthcare services during birth. These are figures from the past, but now the recommendation that we have is that there needs to be an additional healthcare facilities established, especially in remote areas, not just because of the difficulty in transportation, but because these healthcare facilities are very rare. Women, more than any other segment in Yemeni society, have more and specific medical needs, especially with regards to neonatal care, and this causes a lot of or is a significant threat. With regards to violence against women or gender-based violence, I think that establishing additional shelters for the women who need it is very important during this period. During the war, violence in all forms has increased, but especially violence against women. And to be realistic, I don't think we can say that there should be an increased reporting of these kinds of incidents, because the authorities are not cannot be relied upon. But I think establishing shelters or setting up hotlines for women who are facing this violence is very important, and these shelters should be protected. I don't know exactly how this could be done, how they could be protected, but these shelters need to have sufficiently good reputation for women to resort to them. With regards to the economic aspect, and I think Amal has already mentioned them in her recommendations, I believe further economic empowerment of women and including them in the humanitarian or development aid that is presented is very important for Yemeni women, especially since there are studies, one of which is from Sana'a Center, which showed that there was recovery caused, more women were going out into the labor market due to the war and looking for job opportunities more than before. There are a lot more details in the paper, but this is just a brief presentation. Thank you very much.
A million thanks to Marta, to Amal, and Reem for these amazing presentations. 3 very important studies, and each one would deserve a session on its own. And yet I'm very glad that we're seeing them together, because there's so much complementary work in them. We have already seen some questions coming in the chat, but if you have any more questions, please feel free to post them in the chat function. And maybe I can just start with a first question to Marta. And I think it's very interesting how you are speaking about the different age groups and how they are differently affected. And my question is actually on the intergenerational dimension. You're talking about the women in the twilight years who have a relatively stronger freedom and possibility. And we know that women are both upholding traditional structures, but also have a potential to contribute to change. So it would be interesting to hear your reflections on this.
Oh, thank you. Oh, let me turn my camera on. Thank you, Charlotte, for your question. It's very interesting. In designing this research, one of the reasons I kind of decided to frame it in this way is because there are such differences between women and girls and the challenges they face, as well as the opportunities at different phases. And I feel each of them can be agents for social change, but with different constraints and different opportunities. And I think I'm not aware of any programming that has taken kind of an intergenerational approach, trying to at least formally, trying to bring together the strengths of women and girls at various phases and help them work together to design programs or to address needs from these different positions in society, these different phases in their lives. And so I think there's great opportunity here to try to design programming that takes on the needs and the issues and the voices of those women at different phases to try to build stronger outcomes. And so I would, encourage, donors and other stakeholders to try these different types of approaches just to see how progress could be made on certain issues by engaging these different age groups, recognizing their constraints and opportunities that they bring at these different phases. So thank you for your question, Charlotte.
Thank you, Marta. I have a question for Amal. Now, in your presentation and based on your paper, it seems that obviously there's still a number of issues for women, particularly when it comes to the obstacles, challenges, discrimination they face in the labour market and in the employment sector. Now, the question I have, though, is why, after so many decades, 50 years or so of development projects in Yemen, why are these issues still existing? Why do these? Why have there not been improvements, or have there been improvements? And how can we gauge that, considering the amount of investment that's been put into that area?
In terms of improvements, I don't know. I haven't conducted a historical study, but anecdotally, we heard stories from south of Yemen and how progressive laws were, more women-friendly, and so on. But I believe also in the north, we've seen, I think it's all part of a regional setback in terms of women's rights and a rise of, let's say, being more people becoming conservative and so on. But in terms of development projects that are focused on women, I believe that women have never been a priority for development projects. Maybe we can argue Yemen has so many issues, so you cannot prioritize women. But to me, the risk is still there that women are not prioritized, even though they're challenges or the challenges either to the war or just from having more social constraints on their social life and also professional life.
Thank you, Amal. Amal, we lost you there just slightly with the internet connection, I believe. But I think your answer came across. Charlotta, would you like to begin with some of the question and answer session from the chat box?
Yes, absolutely. And maybe we can start with a question question that has been posed here to Reem on how the right change.
Is it Afrah's question? Afrah, if your question is how the report was written, well, I started working on it last year in other writings, and then it accumulated and became the report that we have today. And I re-interviewed the people, the sample who I'd interviewed last year, and I asked them the same questions to see what the changes had been. And the people who had been, what I found interesting was that the people who were working in initiatives to help people, like initiatives to distribute oxygen canisters or to ensure that medical supplies would get across, like the different medical supplies that they needed. They told me during the second round of interviews that they were not prepared to do the same things that they had done during the first wave because they had been under immense psychological stress. There were a lot of questions. Amal asked, Afrah asked me if what was the psychological impact on myself. It was very significant. Some of the women that I interviewed, especially those working in the healthcare sector or in some of the humanitarian initiatives, they were significantly affected. Some of them said that in each one of the visits that she would go out to distribute oxygen canisters, she would see horrible things, and she needed psychological treatment. And she said that during the second wave of the pandemic, she no longer saw it as her responsibility. She said it was the government's responsibility and people's responsibility, and she could no longer continue working on these initiatives. This report was very shocking, but there were some things that I think show that there has been some change over the past few years, especially with women. There has been a very destructive impact, but I think there is a bit of a silver lining. Thank you, Afrah, for your question.
Thank you very much. We'll take another question from the chat box. This question is from Angela Espinosa, and it's directed at Marta. The majority of programs promoting women gravitates around women for obvious reasons, but have you considered the need to change stereotypes through the education of boys? As far as I know, education is segregated, and after puberty, men and women don't have many chances to interact and get to know the realities of the other half of society.
Wow, such an interesting question, because really, I would say the biggest gap in the study that I did was it was about women and girls, not about men and boys. There's very limited research on gender dynamics for men and boys. And I think your point raises that issue and says, we have big gaps in this area. I think the issue that you're asking specifically of me is absolutely, if we want to change gender roles, we have to work on the education of boys and men. And that's essential, actually. Of course, understanding the constraints in Yemeni society and traditional society. And I think that's always the issue about, ensuring that programming that's looking at trying to impact gender relations is adequately, has strong gender analysis backing it up, and that you're not doing more harm than good. And I think this is one of the challenges that I've struggled with, and many people struggle with that are doing programming in Yemen to empower women and girls, is by also not doing more harm by what we're doing. So within the understanding of segregated education, et cetera, what are things that can be done? So I think it's well worth research being done on gender dynamics for men and boys, and looking what are the entry points, where can changes be made, because gender dynamics in Yemen are not just about women and girls, and advocacy programming to try to change some negative gender dynamics need to look at what are the issues that men and boys are also dealing with I mean, the whole issue, I mean, we could go on and on, but the issue of kind of rights and responsibilities, you know, that flip side of the coin, men have more responsibilities for certain things. They also have more rights. So trying to understand, well, what are the dynamics and how can you, what are the entry points there? How can you try to help alleviate some of the heavy burdens that men carry in society in order to, by working together with the women and girls in their family and in their communities. So anyway, a great question though, actually.
So we have one question here on to all of you on how much gender equity is an issue for let me just see if I can find it again, is an issue among Yemeni women and how strong the awareness is about the lack of gender equity. And if we can maybe start with Amal there.
I don't know, I'm not too happy about the question itself because yeah, women know when they're being discriminated against. So we cannot just know. How do you feel, you personally, Charlotta, how do you feel about gender equity? So this is a question we can ask any woman in the world. It's not exclusive to Yemeni women. Yeah, of course, Yemeni women are under repression in terms of gender, but all other women are experiencing some sort of discrimination based on their own gender. So I believe the issue is very important to all women, including Yemeni women.
I would totally and completely agree with you there.
In my opinion, I think that the question isn't are they trying to find equality? It's are they trying to find better lives? I think even the situation that men are living in Yemen, the general situation, the overall situation in Yemen is very bad. And so I think I agree with Emma that I think the question isn't that women trying to find equality, but we as researchers, we obviously are trying to find this kind of equality, but this would not be a question that I ask for Yemeni women, especially not at this time.
Thank you. I'll go on to another question. This one's directed to Marta. Considering the diverse role of women in society over their lifespan and their varied role or standing, what is the real loss of not involving women at different stages of their lives in peacemaking and conflict solving?
It's a huge loss. Whether we're talking about track 1, track 2, track 3, women are, and it's not just that they're not being supported, it's also that it's not being recognized, because there is so much that women are doing as peacemakers in their communities and their homes as it is, but it's not recognized and therefore not supported as strategically and consistently as it could. There are many, many actors, international and many local actors, you know, CSOs, et cetera, that are seeking to empower women in those types of roles. But there's still room for a lot of improvements because they are peacemakers. They do help in negotiating, you know, ceasefires. They help in going across battle lines to provide humanitarian assistance. These roles we know are there, but they're oftentimes not recognized or ignored. And I think that's there are initiatives underway, and there is recognition about this gap, but there's lots of room for improvement in it. So a very interesting question, actually. Over to you, AbuBakr.
Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, there actually is one more question for you, Marta. So this question is to do with mahram, the concept of the mahram, the requirement for women to be accompanied by a male relative, which is increasingly being enforced in certain parts of the country and having important implications for women, for example, the freedom of movement, livelihoods, access to protection services, and access to health, etc. Does the study cover this issue, and do you have any recommendations?
do talk about it briefly in the study, actually, and saying that, having done rural programming for decades in Yemen, starting in the 80s when I was working with Oxfam, and we worked all over the country, formerly North Yemen, as well as the work I've done in other areas in other parts of the country for different organizations. The issue of mahram has been something that's been present for a long time. Of course, there are changes in that practice these days, as was noted in the question. I think one of the challenges is, and when I was working with CARE, we dealt with this we felt, and I do feel that mahrams, if they are being, if it's in a context where families feel the best about having their young women to participate in the public sphere, then there has to be some recognition of that in programming. And one of the things that we did in Karen, which I recommend to others to do, is if it's an area where this is insisted, and if that's the only way you're going to get women to participate, then embrace it and make the most out of it. Use it as a platform to change gender dynamics. And in fact, by including, so if a mahram is going to come with a woman to a training, plan and plan for a parallel training with maharim. That's the best way to do it, because then you have a captive audience, and I can testify to many instances in my own experience and from talking with others where it was a huge, important dynamic in changing gender dynamics in a family, even between a husband and woman. I know of a case of a woman who was a senior manager in an international NGO, and for years her husband came with her to everything. And it was sometimes not so helpful, but we continued to be supported because it had some positive impacts. The person was an amazing manager, etc. Eventually, the husband, because of his interaction in all of these professional environments in development, he actually got a job in development. And then it was no problem. He recognized, he trusted his wife. He had seen how she had interacted in all these cases, and eventually she was able to travel even internationally without her husband. So it can be a force for positive change. I'm not saying that it's a good thing, but it is a reality for many in the country. And I think trying to understand those constraints and work within them to have positive change is really important. And I do say some of this in the report, actually.
Thank you all very much. I will now ask a last question to all of our three panelists, and you have made presentations that have been really rich. But if you want to give us a main takeaway, and maybe not least to the donor community, Reem was speaking very clearly about being realistic in the recommendations, and I think that is one of the great values of the Sana Center, often not only presenting good studies and pointing to the challenges, but really coming up with good recommendations. So your main recommendation that you want the audience to take away with them from this session today, and I suggest we start with Reem and then Amal and then Marta. So Reem, over to you.
Yes, that's true. I've already said the three main recommendations based on the three axes. I don't know if you want, should I repeat them, or do you want me to just sum them up?
No, if you would just have to pick one of them, which one of them would you pick? I mean, they're all very important, but otherwise you can repeat all three of them. I think that is also, it's good for us to have them on in front of our eyes when we leave this meeting.
Okay, exactly. So there are three. I'll say them very quickly, just in a minute. With regards to healthcare for women, I had recommended establishing additional healthcare facilities in remote areas and rural areas. This is one of the biggest challenges that women face. Even before the war and before the pandemic, women die during childbirth at very high rates because of the inability to access healthcare. With regards to gender-based violence, I recommended that additional shelters for battered women be established and they be protected in some way, whether it's protected by international organizations or the government or the authorities. Unfortunately, the government and authorities are not there now, but there needs to be a solution. The third aspect, the economy, the recommendation was also very similar to Amal's recommendation, that there needs to be further representation for women and allocation of funding from donors for Yemen to be more inclusive or to empower women economically. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Reem. Amal.
A very interesting question. Thank you for it. I was thinking of like recommendations on a personal level and on a policy level. On a policy level, we've mentioned everything, but I would just have an extra recommendation to have more women also in the design stage of anything. Okay, because we know our problem, so we can suggest better solutions to them. Okay, that's like, it's a logical sequence of thoughts. But on the personal level, I would just say, like, I grew up in a milieu with working women. That was not a thing. Even more women worked than men. So to me, to do this research was very, very interesting to even like expand my knowledge on the subject. But also I would, the main takeaway for me from this is also to provide support to other women when they seek employment or education in order to become fully financially and economically independent. And I believe if we do that, like forget the policy level, on a personal level, in our social circles, we can create change, even though it can be slow, but it is something worth investing on in the future. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Amal. And Marta, what is your main takeaway?
Oh my gosh, I've just enjoyed so much Amal and Reem's presentations as well, and the things that they had to say, and I learned significantly and took great notes. So it's hard. I would say that it follows on a little bit the question that was asked earlier of me about engaging men and boys in changing gender dynamics. And I guess that would be my takeaway, saying, we do need to try, as wherever we can, whatever entry points we can develop, to engage men and boys in changing gender dynamics, because this has been based on my own life experience as well as observations internationally, that in order to change, entrenched patriarchal attitudes, et cetera, men and boys have to be part of that process and engaged as positively as possible in order to make those changes. And so I guess that would be my final takeaway, that, for us all to remember, gender dynamics are not just about women and girls, they're about men and boys as well. So thank you so much for this opportunity, and for Sana Center for supporting my rather lengthy research, which maybe they didn't anticipate it would be quite so long. But anyway, it was a real pleasure to work with Sana Center on this, and to be able to hopefully contribute to some of their efforts, because they are absolutely essential as a Yemeni civil society and as a leading think tank emerging in the region. So I really appreciate being able to work with them on a couple of studies recently.
Thank you, Marta, and thank you, Reem, and thank you, Amal and Charlotta as well as my co-facilitator. Really interesting discussion and really interesting presentations as well. Thanks as well to the audience for your questions and for listening in and participating. The report Life Phases of a Yemeni Woman Yemeni Women can be found on our website, sanacenter.org. That's SANAA center.org in English and Arabic. Amal and Reem's studies will also be available on the website in the next few weeks. Now, we'd also like to invite you to join us on the 19th of April for a report launch on foreign actors in Yemen, and on the 22nd of April for 2 report launches on Yemeni minorities, the Muhammadin and the Baha'is. We'll be sending invitations with more details soon, and we hope to see you then. Thank you all for joining us.